Hi, I'm James Ford, and I'm the guiding teacher at the Empty Moon Zen Sangha. As some of my friends know, I've been teaching this last semester at the University of the West in their MDiv chaplaincy program. Um, it's been a wonderful experience. It has also pushed me in a lot of areas, not least the fact of the 13 people in this class. Five were Buddhist monastics, three nuns from China, another nun from Korea, and the fifth a monk from Bangladesh, ultimately by way of Sri Lanka. Uh, Half of the balance of the class were raised Buddhist within Chinese cultural contexts. My job was teaching a survey course in Abrahamic texts, the sacred scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The need was for potential, it still is, of course, for potential chaplains to have a sympathetic sense of the dominant religions in North America and the West broadly. And as I said, these people are not from the West. So, television and movies notwithstanding, they do not get many of the things we think of just as the way things are. I noticed a small linguistic tick in many of their essays, possibly most, where they would always add the article when they said God. Not God, but the God. Another point on why I felt at the very beginning maybe we need to just talk about this idea of God. Here in the West, God is such a pervasive idea and so emotionally charged that most people either believe in God or don't believe in God. And it can be hard to move away from that dichotomy. In fact, it is not how the way things actually are. In that class, a lot of my students belong to a whole different category, which is, what is this God of which you speak? The God. They don't have a clue. And the question, or they didn't at the beginning, I hope they do now. The question was asked with no particular emotion attached, just no clear idea about what the word is supposed to point to. The God of the Abrahamic traditions, the God of Judaism, the God of Christianity, and the God of Islam. No real reference points. So, God. While there are different understandings here and there, especially between Judaism and Islam on the one side and Christianity on the other, they are all based in very similar beliefs, or in reaction, non-belief, in a deity with human-like characteristics that has created the world, intervenes here and there on occasion, and at some point will end it all. In Christianity and Islam, the deity will then judge humans on how they lived and maybe how they believed, with rewards and punishments dealt out accordingly. In Judaism, and times are at times are a bit murkier about what the end is supposed to be, but generally doesn't feature any lakes of fire. With these tweaks, that God. St. Thomas Aquinas, the great 14th century Catholic theologian, believed that the idea of God was simply self-evident. I believe the larger majority of Jews, Christians, and Muslims would agree. This is part of why they often find atheists pernicious and even question if they are so out of touch with reality and the self-evident matter, whether they are even trustworthy enough to serve on juries. If you can't be trusted with the evidence before your eyes, how can you be trusted with matters of extreme importance? But the truth of the matter is that it isn't obvious. And actually, there is no clear analog to the Western idea of God in the other religions of the world. Yes, there are ideas of overarching connecting principles in other religions. The idea of Brahman in Hinduism, for instance. There's also Shangdi, the first ancestor, and maybe even Tian, heaven, in indigenous Chinese religions. I, you know, I can think of things like that. Wakan Tanka and the Sioux religion, Gitche Manito among the Algonquins, and with differences within numerous other Native American communities, where there is a more animistic and sometimes mystical force, which in modernity is often collapsed as the Great Spirit. But with any digging at all, none of these things are in fact particularly like the God of the Bible or the Quran. So, no, actually the idea of God as conceived of here in the West is not self-evident. I have a seat of the pants understanding of an evolutionary story of God, the birth and growth of God. But for the class, I needed to review some details. And along the way, I learned some things. And while it seemed to me you all might find it a helpful pointer or two on your spiritual paths if I were to share some of this with you. So today, let's look at that birth of God, the God of the West, and what that God might mean for us. Children of the post-Enlightenment, post-modern, really post-postmodern, Buddhist fellow travelers, the spiritually curious. For us, in a time of disbelief and quest, what can God mean for you and for me? Me, where I started was with the non-human and the class. I start with the non-human animal world. There are elements that we can discern as religious-like in some animal behaviors. Of course, there is nothing to suggest non-human animals believe in God or gods, or many of the other things one generally associates with religions, like praying or worshiping. But they do things that we associate with human religions. For instance, many animals engage in ritual behaviors. Jane Goodall, as an example, observes how chimpanzees appear to dance when they come upon waterfalls and do something similar at the beginning of rainstorms. Many animals also appear to observe funeral rites. In preparing for the class, I watched a video clip of elephants doing what certainly looked like ritual mourning for one of their own. One could say animals may not be religious, but some of them sure look to be spiritual. For humans, we see archaeological evidence of similar behaviors as far back as maybe 100,000 years, with grave sites that include what are called grave goods, such as tools and ornaments, and how in many places there is evidence that corpses were covered in flowers. This is true with both us, the Homo sapiens sapien, and our close cousins, the Neanderthals. As an aside, and as regards the other great interbreeding human population with our main line, the Denisovians, we haven't so far found much physical evidence of their cultures. But there is no compelling reason to assume they, or the yet unnamed but genetically identified fourth group of early interbreeding humans, did not also share these behaviors. These spiritual, if not quite yet religious behaviors, can reasonably be assumed to be common to us all. While there is no evidence of belief in some idea of a supreme being, there are strong suggestions of spiritualities as pretty basic to us as humans. By this, I mean there seems to be some common sense among humans of mystery and connectedness that extend beyond the bare phenomenon of life and the reality of death. From here, it seems important to look at the hunter-gatherer religious views. The 19th century anthropologist Edward Tyler coined the term animism, to address what he observed. This term has been worked and reworked in the years following based upon further research, as well as noting hidden biases in interpretation among him and other early Western ethnographers. The first observation was how in these cultures pretty much across the globe, everything is animated. Everything possesses a spirit or spirits. At the beginning, Professor Tyler, the first professor of anthropology at Oxford, thought animism was a confusion between animals and plants and inanimate things. He had felt this weak sense of categories was an obviously mistaken view, one common, it appeared, to all early humans. And this confusion of categories would also be a building block of later organized religions. Very 19th century, very Eurocentric. Contemporary anthropologist Nurit David speaks for the shift in interpretation, suggesting instead how animism is in fact a relational epistemology. Epistemology is a $5 word meaning how we know things. So, an expensive term, but worth it. It calls us to notice such things as how we know things. Specifically, animism is an approach to life that is centered in our relationships. It is a world filled with subjects rather than objects. Everything is relational. Let's put a pin in that. We'll revisit it before I'm done. The term evolution is itself fraught, as for most of us, it implies directionality. That change leads to things that are improvements upon that which they preceded. That can be true, especially in the biological sciences where evolution is about adaptation and continuance of one's gene pool. But mostly it just means things change. Over time in history, various things got clustered together to form religions as we understand them today. And as we attempt to unravel that part of human cultures we see as religious, we find several things. Probably the most offensive of these various things making up religion for many of us in modernity could be called crowd control. It has to do with that aspect of religion which is all about cultural and specifically the preservation and transmission of cultures over time. While it is very important to the coherence of a culture, it has an enormously conservative aspect, and that conservative, which can be a wonderful and good thing, here has a deep shadow. It clearly defines who is in and who is out. And while from the inside it offers comfort, for anyone on the outside, any kind of outside, it can be deadly. But there's a lot more in that bag that is religion. There's also religion as the repository of ethics, the place we go for guidance on how to act in this world. Still, another thing that has been a part of religion since forever has been healing. Even today, prayer and rites to facilitate the healing of body and mind are common currency of religions. And more importantly, maybe most importantly, at least from my perspective, is how religion is about meaning and purpose in life. These four different things, and no doubt some others, are bound up together and sometimes are near impossible to untangle each from the other. With that, we come to the arc of religion in the Near East. With agriculture, religious institutions began to emerge. Here we find, as with other agriculturally based cultures, the emergence of gods. Gods are non-human entities that have power and with whom we humans interact. Among a small group of people in the hilly areas of Canaan, Some were peasants, others escaped slaves, and including among them some who had escaped bondage in Egypt, all gradually began to see themselves as a people. They felt different than other Canaanites, and they began to tell stories about themselves as part of the evolving of that subculture. Actually, two different traditions of these stories would be gathered together. They occurred in two stages. With the first stage, we get that sense of a coherent people. It becomes historical about 1,000 years before the Common Era, when a kingdom was gathered by someone named David. And then his son Solomon consolidated the kingdom and built from a small town a fairly grand capital, Jerusalem. Here is the first birthing of Israel. Their kingdom didn't last long. It broke into two kingdoms. Then, not all that much later, the Babylonians swept through the region and carried away the intellectual remains of that group. There, in the 6th century before our Common Era, by the waters of Babylon, people began a second editing of the stories. When the Babylonians were themselves conquered, these captives were allowed to return to their homeland. They returned with a book that was largely what we think of as the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, plus a few more books largely consisting of mythic histories. A really interesting thing in that archaeological record is that before the Babylonian captivity, the Israelites were in practice not monotheists. They talked a good game, but in practice they were a form of henotheists, where one believes in many gods, but one deity is more important. People frequently covered bases with offerings of various sorts to their many gods. The archaeological record is littered with statuettes of gods, goddesses, whatnot in Israel. Also, just as interesting a tidbit, during this period before Babylon, there's evidence that showed that the primary god sometimes was portrayed as having a wife. The newly created Bible mashed a lot of things together. At the beginning, those two different story traditions. The earliest strata god was sometimes nothing more than a storm deity, and at other times something fierce. A deity who demanded sacrifice and exercised astonishing punishments on those who strayed in any of several directions. But in the editing process, actually we have a name for the principal editor, Ezra. He and his team came up with a rather different God. And that's the God we know, or very much the beginnings of the God we know, who created and sustains the world. The one who worked in mysterious ways. Definitely a God, not a God to be messed with, but something more. They introduced a God that had those elements, but was vastly different than what had been conceived of before. Something compelling. Now there was some God who was as intimate with the world as a kiss. And in the re-established Israel, the archaeological record shows no statuettes or evidences of any other gods. Now, there was only one God. And according to this new Bible, the God that wasn't just their God, although they did have a special covenant, but now this was a God of the whole world. A God that represents love and forgiveness, and most of all, was a God of hope. In this sad, sad world, a God many find compelling. Maybe not self-evident, but this God has touched many hearts. I find myself returning to that earlier idea of how the world works, and particularly that idea of finding our meaning in a world where we are not objects to each other, but that we relate subjectively. That is where each of us is meaningful just because we exist. If we dig into it, it makes a certain sense. We are, in fact, created out of each other. And by we, I mean us, you and me, the humans, but also the animals, and also the plants, and also the seemingly inanimate world. Through strands of cause and effect, we are created and we create. Dr. King's single garment of destiny. We look deeply and discover how rich and truly mysterious we and this world are. And while we humans may have created that God which represents this deeper and ancient sense of connection, it is our attempt to capture something true about who we are and what this world is. So, for my class, and maybe for all of us, some sympathy for the tradition seems worthy. And there's more to this as well. Not only does God have a birth, but God is growing. And we're encountering ever richer nuances of what this greater of which we are a part might be. As simply two examples of many Vedanta and Buddhism offer perspectives on reality that are already reshaping Western understandings of ultimacy and with that of God. We know humans are a dangerous lot. And when we open our hearts, we notice the connections. Then we may be dangerous, but we're also something else. In the traditions of the West, we become the children of God. Maybe that's something for us to consider. In fact, may we be worthy of that possibility.